We have some questions. We have a couple of questions on the Q&A. We'll start with those. Ed asked two, and I think I'll combine these. Who bought the state-owned industrial enterprises? What were the origins of this new ownership class? He says, you used the term Chinese monopoly capitalism. How did such a consolidation of ownership occur so quickly?
All right, well, that's a very good pair of questions. The state-owned enterprises were by and large bought up by sort of sections of the Chinese bureaucracy that turned itself into the new capitalist ruling class in China. And the way in which they were privatized really facilitated that, in that often sort of shares were distributed out to each worker at this factory, and then workers there were heavily pressured to sell or give those shares to a particular manager or leader within that industry. And so it sort of consolidated the selling off of those industries to a section of the bureaucracy, which then gained this sort of independent economic role where it directly controlled capital in China, not just through, its role as a bureaucracy, but actually through a role as a private owner. And that also ties into how consolidation of ownership occurred so quickly in China, is that these state-owned enterprises were, very large centralized companies. And so when they were sold off to a very small handful of people, that allowed for a great deal of the consolidation of large industry in a very quick manner. And you also have the factor, just like how Russia in the early 1900s sort of had an extensive amount of large industry relative to its total industry because it had developed that industry later. Capitalism in China sort of started off with developing these sort of major institutions, and it started from a base of this previously centralized apparatus in the hands of the Chinese workers' state. You can particularly see an example of this in as well in like the Chinese banks, which remain notionally state-owned, but in practice had established their sort of economic and political independence from the state to a large extent, and also were set up norms of operation that were more consistent with state-owned firms in places like Brazil, rather than the previous examples in China. And banks are some of the most heavily consolidated area in China. And China's largest banks are actually much larger than, in terms of assets, than a lot of U.S. banks, and certainly much larger than French or German or other European or Japanese banks.